Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. Hello and welcome to Perinatal Wellbeing episode number 22, the second part of our discussion about the impact of racism on reproductive health with Rochelle Maurice. Last episode, we discussed obstetrical racism, reproductive justice, generational trauma, and much more. On today's episode, we will talk about the importance of applying an intersectional lens when thinking about care of people in the perinatal period, including the intersections of racism, disabilities, and accessing care. Rochelle Maurice is a clinical and organizational ethicist based in Toronto, Ontario. Her work in ethics was strongly influenced by her professional background in social work, the most significant of which was in the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit and Paediatrics Department in a community hospital in Toronto. As a result of her experiences in both social work and ethics, Rochelle has an interest in and passion for addressing issues that affect pregnant, birthing, and postpartum people at the intersection of health and social care. She is currently pursuing doctoral studies in social work that focuses on Black women's experiences in maternal-child care. I'm curious to hear from you in terms of your work and your research. What have you seen in terms of the impacts of racism and all the things that we've talked about so far on birthing people, and specifically in labor and delivery?
Okay, so I'll give you like a policy example. This is like a classic policy example that I use, and I say policy, and really that's like the lens through which I'm viewing it. But maybe I'll tell it another way. When I was working as a social worker in the NICU and Pediatrics department, I was working in a community that part of the community was exceedingly affluent. And then there was another pocket of the community where you saw sort of like transient immigration, right? And so, where you'd have people coming in or groups of people coming in under refugee status, there was a pocket of the community where a lot of these groups would settle. And so you'd be able to get a good, like if your head was in the ground, and you'd be able to get a good sense as to what was going on sort of immigration wise and refugee status wise, based on the populations of, birthing people that were coming into the hospital as refugee, I don't want to say claimants, but who are like applying for refugee status in the community.
Right.
And there was a particular time when we would see a number of these birthing people coming in from a particular population, and they would say they had very little or no prenatal care. And the birthing person would, oftentimes be like slightly unwell or very unwell. And just trying to understand, and as a social worker, trying to speak with them and to understand the context in which things were going on, and we were using our standards of this ties it all in together very well. No prenatal care or very little prenatal care. What was supposed to happen it was supposed to automatically make you think about how engaged is this birthing person with their
Pregnancy,
soon to be child, with their pregnancy, and like if they are not that engaged in pregnancy, what does that mean for when they are like, they have to take the child to doctor's appointments and things like that. How connected are they to health and healthcare systems? And knowing sort of in our medical model, the frequency with which a newborn needs to see a physician within the first month of life is quite intensive, right? But also framing the thinking around, this person is clearly unwell. What have they been doing in their pregnancy to not secure their own physical health and well-being, so that it would, like, all of these like things, and I'm saying it right now, and I just like, I'm cringing that this was the way that we were trained to think about these things.
Right.
And so what had happened was the interim federal health program, which was the funding structure, the monies used that provided to refugee claimants, people coming in requesting refugee status for health care. And so there was a period of time in order to reform the interim federal health program. They said that prenatal care or perinatal care was not covered. Labor and delivery was covered.
Wow.
And so, you have, sort of refugee claimants coming in, can't afford the prenatal care. They come in knowing that they're unwell. They present to the emergency department, or they present to labor and delivery. And so the cost then became quite exorbitant, because if they themselves, the birthing person themselves, is very unwell, then there is the cost of potentially, if it's preeclampsia, extremely high blood pressure, then there's potentially the cost of an ICU stay. Then there's the ICU admission for the infants. It's all of these things that are wrapped up. And so it never, there was this very sort of this Western way of thinking about, why aren't you focused enough on your pregnancy to get the prenatal care, not even understanding the policy changes and the financial situation of the person coming into the country. And then added on top of that, the asking of all of the questions, these kinds of questions.
Yes.
Heaven knows what they went through before they came into the country, what kinds of interrogation that they went through. And then on top of that, not understanding a system in which being truthful about these answers triggers the next person to come on and say, we're not going to monitor you and your abilities as a parent because you haven't met our standards.
Right. And we're not doing that from a trauma-informed, I mean, that's the least of it, right? But not understanding immigration or, fleeing your country, not understanding the impacts of people, and then not even knowing the policies that are, in existence in the system you work in. Right. And it is that perspective of blame the birthing person, blame the person. What have they done wrong? Let's interrogate them first and see what they did wrong to not connect to their pregnancy, to not connect to their baby, to not get the proper care, like you said, without understanding.
And so this is why an intersectional lens is really important here.
Yes.
Right? Really, really, really important. And not only that, so now I'm kind of thinking out loud, so forgive me. But so imagine a circumstance in which we're yes, we will use an intersectional lens or focus with people coming in under refugee status or refugee claimants that are coming in to give birth. But you have a young birthing person who has done their best in life to make ends meet, despite all kinds of other social circumstances, or all kinds of maybe not other social circumstances. They're doing their best, and we don't use an intersectional lens over here. Right. And so this then becomes this issue of equity. Right. So I think my argument here is that really applying sort of really applying an intersectional lens consistently is really important to do this well. And so what it is key in the example that I gave around sort of the interim federal health, and they realized, to wrap up that story, they realized what was going on very quickly. And the reforms, they reversed the reforms very quickly.
Gotcha.
And by quickly, I think it was like maybe a couple of years.
That's pretty
So
quick
not pretty quick as far
for the
as sort
government.
of legislation goes. Yeah, exactly. But like if we apply an intersectional lens here and we come to understand somebody's circumstance in that particular way, we have to be able to apply it consistently for people to be treated fairly.
Right. And that means, again, for people that, are not necessarily in this world in terms of their professional work, but it's like that intersection of like all the things that are part of someone's life or their identity, whether we're talking about race, gender, age, weight,
Socioeconomic status, yes, weight, sexual orientation,
religion, language, all of the things that make us us, that make a person a person. All of those things matter. All of those things matter. And even, when you're talking about like specifically the care and like going to appointments or not going to appointments, or even coming to a brand new country, potentially coming out of a traumatic situation, potentially war, wherever someone's coming from, and then in a brand new country where maybe English is not your first language, and so you're looking for these services in a brand new country, you're pregnant, or you've maybe just become pregnant. That's a very vulnerable time as it is, and having to do all these things in a new country, you don't know anyone, you feel not connected potentially, right? Like you said, there could be people around you, you don't know where these people are, you don't know how to connect them, or you don't feel connected. And in labor and delivery, and I'm also thinking, sorry, jumping back, but the language barrier too, and how big that can impact us in this perinatal period, right? If we're not fully understanding what a professional is telling us about what's going on with our pregnancy or our baby in labor and delivery, if we're not fully supported by someone who speaks our language fluently, how does that impact us? How does that contribute to fear? Oh gosh, I don't know. It just weighs heavy.
It does. And I think about not only that, but like, this is going to sound pretty, I don't even have a really good example of it, but like a turn of phrase, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if there are particular ways of saying things or describing feelings, sensations, experiences that are not common within North America,
yep.
How do you then you are, even though English, like you speak English to whatever degree of fluency,
mm-hmm.
you are then burdened with trying to find a way to make it make sense to the people that are meant to help you, right? And if that has not been a part of your system of processing, your way of communicating, so we're asking people then at a particular point, or I don't even want to call it a health state, because that's sort of medicalizing or pathologizing something, the birthing experience in a particular way. But like, we're asking somebody while in labor to then do the thing, like, okay, but I know you understand it, but then make me understand it, and to cycle through all of the words that they have, all of the expressions, all of the emotions that they have, to make it make sense to get help in that state, which is, to me seems a little bit ludicrous. I don't have a good solution for like, well, what then can people do? Because that's all we all have. But I think about not necessarily just like language, like a different language as a barrier, but I also too think then about
Cultural
just
norms.
ways of cultural norms, ways of communicating that don't necessarily adhere to North American structures.
Absolutely.
And probably like the sort of like the most obvious example of that is that somebody working in healthcare who then goes and has an experience in healthcare, birthing otherwise, knows what to say and how to say it to communicate the particular thing with the shortest amount of words possible, versus somebody who has not had any previous interactions with healthcare. Or even like, and even sort of on the continuum, somebody with a chronic condition that has multiple experiences with healthcare, knows what to say, knows how to anticipate it, even though they don't work in healthcare, they know how to communicate because of the indoctrination within sort of the system of communication, versus somebody who, you know, born and raised in Toronto, has never had good reason in their adult years to go and interact with in a hospital setting.
Right.
And just trying to find the words to communicate and to describe their experiences and to make these words make meanings and to count in a particular way so that they can get the help that they need.
Right. And does that also factor into the obstetric violence that occurs, the higher numbers of death amongst Black, Indigenous, people of color who are birthing in Canada? Do those things factor into that?
I think so. That's a great question. And I had not thought about this before. And I have not read anything sort of that jumps out at me in this moment that says this. But I think for argument's sake, yes. Like if we were to sort of parallel, you know, what I was saying about in terms of language and in terms of culture, like you said, in the cultural context, then yes, I would say so. But also, you know, also not like I'm not necessarily thinking about, you know, new immigrants or first generation immigrants or Indigenous people. I'm thinking too about people for whom sort of this understanding of this generational trauma and understanding racism in a particular way have come to sort of have this awareness of, you know, the risks that their sort of existence and their being brings into these kinds of interactions in healthcare. One of the things that I read about recently, and it's, you know, it landed on me sort of through a personal experience, that enslaved people used to find ways of coping with sort of the challenges that were associated with childbirth, and like perinatal morbidity or mortality, and found ways, and they were passed on within generations and between generations about the kinds of things that you need to say and do in order to ensure your safety or your infant's safety. And so I think about that, like when I think about culture and sort of unpacking culture a little bit more, I think about that as a cultural component that is unique perhaps to a subgroup of people that isn't mainstream or commonplace.
Right. Absolutely. And then I'm thinking too, again, if you're in this position of having to advocate more for yourself because you are part of these communities, right? Imagine having to do that, but not having the language to be able to do that. And let's also not forget the intersection with disabilities. And
oh my goodness.
Right? If you come to this country and you have a disability, how much less access you're going to have to care. And even if you do access that care, how much more difficult that would be for someone.
Disability, oh my goodness. So disabilities, you could do like 2 other podcasts.
Oh, definitely.
On disabilities and disabilities and, the perinatal period.
Mm-hmm.
There are theories specific to like disability studies that I don't feel very proficient in.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of and when we talk about sort of the intersectional aspect, there's lots of things that come up, but I think to tumble down the rabbit hole around disabilities, and we're not even just talking about like, sometimes when people think disabilities, they think of physical disabilities.
Right.
And it's also the disabilities that we cannot see when we look at somebody.
Absolutely.
And those are the ones that I think there's some struggles. There's some really, really struggles because of these really archaic conception of what counts as a disability and what is a disability. I'm so glad that a lot of the discourses have started to change around that, and the recognition has really started to change around that. It's still, I think, sometimes I worry that it still requires somebody to disclose and be believed, right. Especially when there are power hierarchies. Gosh, there's so much, like,
I know.
I feel like you've opened up the door to another room, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how could we have forgotten about this room?
I know. And I just, I wanted to say it just to really hold space for that like, this is still, a massive issue, again, that like we don't talk about enough. And, so it's like, even if people can just listen to this and then the takeaway is like, just thinking about it, just put that in your mind that these challenges exist. That would be my hope.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for holding space for disability. And I think part of the trouble is that when people talk about equity and diversity, the discourse usually makes people think about race, but it's so much more than that. And sort of holding space deliberately for disability and continuing to hold space intentionally for disability, and not even just holding space, but like really talking about equity, not just in terms of race, but we're talking about equity in terms of a large group of things, including disability. We need to acknowledge that. Gosh, there's so much, and I will not be able to do it justice.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, if we're going to apply that lens of intersection to one, patient or group of people, or various groups, we have to apply that lens to everybody. And it is a lot to think about. However, when we're in places of privilege, that's where we're like, well, but it doesn't really concern me. It's not a big deal. If they go to the hospital, it's accessible. There's ramps. So that's enough. We don't need to think about it. The hospital's got it. That's not enough. Like you said, right? Like, it's not just physical disability. And even if we talk about physical disability, it's a wide range of
spectrum. Yes.
Right. So again, like, just I know that is definitely not where we were going, but just again, like, thinking of how that intersection, again, with race, with culture, language barriers, how difficult that would be.
Incredibly difficult. And to your point, I mean, you talked about, people from a place of privilege, and what I really want to raise is that privilege, and I want to say that privilege not only from, and we're not talking about like necessarily like a race privilege. You know what I mean? Because I identify as a Black woman. I am a Black woman, but I am able-bodied, and I hold privilege. And it's important to recognize, and this is one of the key bits about sort of like an intersectional framework or way of thinking, which is there's always like, privilege and oppression, like hold hand in hand. So you have to think about yourself in a particular context of like where, in what spaces and in what ways do I hold privilege?
Right.
And it's easy for somebody to say, oh, you're doubly oppressed. And I'm like, I have a lot of privilege. And I have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. When we were just talking through this, and I'm thinking of my own experiences as delivering my children. I am a white cisgendered woman. And so for me, interacting with my healthcare provider, going into hospitals to have my children, to labor and deliver, I did not have a fear about how I would be perceived by healthcare providers, how they would treat me. That was never in the back of my head. It's never been in the back of my head. Again, because of privilege, and like you said, kind of people always holding those things in the back of their mind. From my perspective, I think like that's where we have to start, is like owning our own shit, owning and like acknowledging, our privilege, and how do I contribute to these systems? Because I do, as a white woman, I do contribute to these systems. Absolutely.
It is not just white people that contribute to systems of oppression.
Right.
Right. So let's take a little step back.
Okay.
Maybe it's a little bigger than I want to, but so when we think about, so we've talked about, you and I have talked a lot about like, white supremacy and sort of embedded in the structures, the way that we think, the systems, the institutions that, sort of all interact with each other to create standards of what an ideal person, what an ideal mother looks like, what an ideal parent looks like, all of these things. But it's pervasive all throughout, right? And so when we start to think about like whiteness, not skin color at all. We think about sort of embodying that system of thinking, embodying that, like those ways of being. And anybody of, any race, any ethnicity, any gender, like all of the things in which we've talked about can embody whiteness and those ways of thinking and being and knowing in any particular way. And so that's the point, right? So, so as a person of color, upholding systems or not even trying to challenge systems where like Children's Aid Society and using the standards and participating in it, right? And participating in standards where like Children's Aid Society would, based on the line of questioning and that I have to ask in order for them to determine whether they will become involved or intervene in a particular way or not, that is upholding whiteness, right? So that is like, that's an example of people of color or like not just white people contributing to systems of oppression.
I think that it's important to realize like the pervasiveness of living in, a patriarchal, white supremacist focused kind of society where like whiteness is centered, right? Like, and contributed to the foundation of these systems like we're talking about. But again, those are like big picture things, but that system influences pretty much all of us to participate in the system, to keep the system going. So I just want to like acknowledge that.
And you're absolutely right. This very sort of one-dimensional way of saying like, this can't be racist because a Black person's there, or this can't have like, or can't be contributing to racism or like be upholding racist structures because there's a person of color there is ludicrous.
Right. Right. But I will tell
It
you,
is
there's a lot of
absolutely
people
ludicrous.
that think that that's true. So I think it's important for us to
Yeah,
acknowledge, like, we got to challenge that. Right.
100% every single time,
Right.
every single time.
Right.
Yes. But it is being aware. And it's like when it's not second nature to you, when you're not like, as somebody who doesn't have the lived experience to say, I know what this is and I can name it, it's very difficult to try to start to see these things.
Mm-hmm.
It is really about understanding sort of the interactions of all of these systems and how they may sort of constrain somebody's life,
Mm-hmm.
somebody's choices, somebody's autonomy, their ability to exercise, their autonomy. And also kind of factoring in as well, just thinking about like, how do you begin to like call those things into question, those systems into question? How, like, what can you do to be able to say, yes, but can we look at it this way? Yes, but do you see what's happening there? And I don't want to say that what needs to happen is like, a change happens from, yes, protesting and different forms of protesting, not only just marching in the streets. And there's, there historically, there's like great things that come out of marching, but there's very different ways of protesting that drives change as well. But also activism, allyship, but within the community, right? Working with people for whom this is their lives, this is their daily experience, and making sure to work with like grassroots in the community, but also calling attention in spaces where those voices may not be heard or do not have seats at the table, to be able to say, I don't think we have all the right people here. I think that we're thinking about this particular issue in a very limited way. I think, but there's another way of thinking about this that has this impact this way. I think it's all of these things coming together.
Right. Right. And so can I ask you, on a like real, average person, and what I mean is like someone who's not working in this field, how do we challenge these systems? Or like, where does someone start?
Start small, start where you are. I know there's probably like a social media post that describes this, like, start scared, start from the beginning, just start. And I don't mean to make light of it, but just start, ask questions.
Yes, I think that's so key, right? Is like asking the questions. Because I mean, none of us have all the answers, right? But if we ask the questions, we dialogue, we just have these discussions, open up, right? Like, and also like, we all make mistakes. Everyone's going to make mistakes, and we can own it, right? Oh, hey, I used to use this term and now I understand that that's not appropriate. I'm going to make changes to that, or I never even thought about that system in that way. And now I've learned about it, and I'm going to keep that in the forefront of my mind. I'm not going to forget that, I mean, there's so many different ways, but I think like educating yourself, not, and educating yourself, not necessarily asking people in the communities that you're trying to educate yourself on to educate you, especially for free.
Yes. And then to your point though, around educating yourself, asking questions, coming to a place of knowing and being and understanding. You, like, this is a very humbling experience, because you have to come to understand and embrace that you will not know everything, and you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right.
Right.
And I think coming at it with compassion, being humble, asking questions, being open, right? It's okay for someone to call you out, and tell you like, hey, you know what? That's inappropriate. And we can handle that. It's okay. You can take that and then
Yeah.
have the discussion.
Yeah. I think what else is important too is that when you're thinking about issues, particular issues or topics or things that arise, thinking about it sort of outside of your world sphere or your bubble, right? And I could sit down and watch news and be like, well, what about people like me?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And people like me, if it's a particular, small category,
Mm-hmm.
in the larger scale of people altogether, but trying to think outside of that and think about who else might this affect, like who's going to be impacted by this. And that's really the act of like trying to move people from the margins into the center.
Mm-hmm.
And that act of centering, the experiences of people who don't get the space, who aren't often considered or centered, really starts to make the discussions, the thinking, and the very issues that we're talking, starts to frame them in a different way. And it opens up your understanding and your world to so many other things when you start to think about, oh, that doesn't really have a huge impact on me, but how might it affect somebody else?
Right. Right. I think even like you said, start small, but asking that question of like, oh, this is not a big deal for me, but how does this impact someone else? That can be a great place to start.
Yes. And when you get to the point of like, I think I know how it's going to impact somebody else, starting to challenge other people to think about these things. And we're not like, this is like, there's some really tricky conversations that could happen here. And no, like, I'm not asking you to like divide your friend and foe. Like, this is
Yes.
not,
Yes.
you got to pick your hills, where you're going to fight these battles, how you're going to fight these battles, and the ones that you're willing to die on. But I think what's important is sort of raising people's awareness from the perspective of, well, how do you think about this? Or what about that particular, like the same questions that you were asking yourself, start to ask it more openly. And you may find yourself in a space that, like you're in social settings and you're, like you can't unsee it. So you're doing this thing, but also in spaces for people in positions of power around these issues, starting to raise these things to them. Like, have you thought about, I was thinking about this particular policy or this particular action or this particular issue. And it struck me that while it may not impact me in this kind of a way, or I may be impacted in this kind of a way, I'm wondering about people for whom ABC or XYZ have these conditions.
Right.
That may be really like bearing the brunt of this. And I think that's super important to think about as well.
Right. Right. I think those are amazing, like realistic ways for people to, like you said, start where they're at, start asking questions, challenging ideas and thoughts. And yeah, sometimes it's scary to let go of things that maybe we believed our whole lives, right? And again,
You
that's this.
feel like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, because you're just
Yes.
like what were the things that I was able to hang my hat on that are now gone?
Yeah.
And it's destabilizing in some respects, but I promise you will find level ground again.
Yes. Yes. Amazing. So, Rochelle, thank you so much for opening up this incredible discussion. I mean, I think we have offshoots of many different podcasts here. But again, I love opening up the discussion. Let's put this stuff out there. Let's challenge our thinking, other people's thinking. Let's start talking. Where can people reach you?
Oh my goodness. So probably the easiest way is through my Instagram account. It is _, Rochelle Maurice _.
Perfect. And so I will link that in the show notes so people can click on it. Thank you so much, Rochelle. I really appreciate you being here and talking and sharing your knowledge and wisdom and experience.
No, oh gosh, I thank you for this opportunity. You're so incredible and so easy to talk to, and make this so much fun. And I hope that people are able to get something, at least something out of this. Because you're right, there's so much to be said here, but I'm so grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks, Rochelle. Today was another in-depth discussion about racism and reproductive health and the importance of applying an intersectional lens when thinking about care of people in the perinatal period, including the intersections of racism, disabilities, and accessing care. You can find Rochelle on Instagram at _Rochelle Maurice _. Please leave me a comment and let me know your takeaway from today's discussion. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports or go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, podcast episodes, and ways to connect with us. Check out our new episode every other Monday.